You haven't been bored in years. Not once. Not really. Think about the last time you stood in a room with nothing to look at, nothing to listen to, and nothing at all to do, and stayed there long enough to feel the minutes stretch. Not waiting, not scrolling. Just empty. You probably can't find that memory, and you might assume that's a victory. But the real answer is far stranger. Boredom was never a flaw in the human experience. It was equipment. It was one of the oldest tools your mind carried, sharpened across hundreds of thousands of years, and you happen to be alive at the exact moment it is quietly going extinct. You are not the generation that beat boredom. You are the generation that lost it. Start with something small: the elevator, the line at the pharmacy, the 40 seconds while a page loads. Every one of those gaps used to be empty. Now every one of them is filled, instantly without a decision being made. Your hand moves before your mind asks it to. That gap had a name for most of human history. It also had a job. Here is the first strange thing. The word itself is almost brand new. The English word boredom barely existed before the middle of the 19th century. It appears in Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House in 1852, describing a woman so exhausted by her own life that she is dying of it. Before that, English speakers had to reach for other words. The French had ennui. The medieval monks had acedia. So did boredom simply not exist before we had a word for it? No. It existed. It just wore different clothes. The classicist Peter Touhey, who wrote an entire history of the feeling, found it scratched into the walls of Pompeii and stamped into Roman inscriptions almost 2,000 years old. People complaining, in stone, that nothing was happening. In the 4th century, a desert monk named Evagrius Ponticus described what he called the noonday demon. It arrived in the heat of the afternoon and made the hours crawl. It made a monk stare out the window. It made him convinced that his life was pointless and that he should be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. That is boredom, described with terrifying precision 1,600 years before anyone had a name for it. So the feeling is ancient. What changed is not the feeling. What changed is that you can now escape it in under a second. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand what boredom actually is, because almost everyone gets this wrong. You probably think boredom is the absence of stimulation. Nothing to do, therefore bored. Simple. It isn't. John Eastwood, a psychologist at York University in Toronto, spent years defining it more carefully. His description is this: boredom is the unfulfilled desire for satisfying activity. Read that again. It's not emptiness, it's wanting. It's the uncomfortable state of your attention being available and hungry and unable to lock onto anything worth holding. That distinction is everything, because it means you can be surrounded by infinite content and still be profoundly bored. It means the feeling is not about how much is happening around you. It's about whether your attention has found something that means anything. Boredom, in other words, is not a lack of input. It's a signal. So what is the signal for? Think of it the way you think of physical pain. Pain isn't the injury. Pain is the alarm that tells you to move your hand off the stove. People born with a rare condition that prevents them from feeling pain do not live charmed lives. They live short, dangerous ones because they break bones and never notice. Boredom is that alarm, but for meaning. It's the internal signal that says, what you are currently doing is not worth your one finite life. Go find something that is. That signal is why your ancestors invented things. Picture a human being 200,000 years ago. The dangerous work is done. The food is gathered. The light is fading, and there are hours left before sleep. There is no screen. There is no book. There is nothing to consume. What happens inside a mind in that gap? It starts to wander. It replays yesterday. It rehearses tomorrow. It notices that a stone with a certain edge cuts better than a stone without one. It begins, without permission, to tell itself a story. Neuroscientists have actually watched this happen. In 2001, a researcher named Marcus Rachel at Washington University noticed something odd in brain scans. He was looking for the parts of the brain that switch on during hard tasks. What he found instead was a network of regions that switched on when people were doing nothing at all and switched off the moment a task began. He called it the default mode network, the brain's idling state. Except it isn't idling. That network is where you think about yourself, where you imagine other people's minds, where you construct your past and simulate your future. It's where you assemble the sense that you are a continuous person moving through time, and it only fully comes online when nothing else is demanding you. Do you see the problem yet? If the machinery that builds your sense of self runs during your empty moments and you have deleted your empty moments, what happens to the machinery? Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this has been tested directly. In 2014, a psychologist at the University of Virginia named Timothy Wilson published a study in the journal Science with a deceptively gentle title. He asked people to sit alone in a plain room for somewhere between 6 and 15 minutes with no phone, no book, no distractions. The only instruction was to entertain themselves with their own thoughts. Most of them hated it. They reported the experience as unpleasant. They found it hard to concentrate. Their minds, given freedom, mostly returned discomfort. Then Wilson and his colleagues ran the version that made the study famous. They put people in the same empty room, but left one option available: a button that would deliver a mild electric shock. Every participant had already tried the shock beforehand and confirmed it was unpleasant. Many said they would pay money to never feel it again. Left alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes, a large share of them pressed it anyway. One man pressed it 190 times. Read that again. Given a choice between their own unfiltered mind and physical pain, a meaningful number of ordinary adults chose the pain. And that was in 2014, before the algorithm learned your face. So the obvious conclusion is that boredom is torture, and escaping it is progress. Except that same year, another result pointed in the exact opposite direction. Sandy Mann and Rebecca Cadman, working at the University of Central Lancashire, took a group of people and gave them the dullest task they could design: copying numbers out of a phone book, by hand, for a quarter of an hour. Then they asked those people to do something creative. Come up with as many uses as you can for a plastic cup. The bored group beat the control group, not slightly. Clearly, they generated more ideas and stranger ones, and when the researchers made the task even more boring, just reading the numbers rather than writing them, the creative results went up again. So boredom is unbearable. And boredom makes you inventive. Both are true. That's not a contradiction. That's the entire design. Boredom is supposed to be unpleasant. That's the point. Discomfort is what makes a signal impossible to ignore. It pushes, it nags, it makes you get up and change something. The unpleasantness is the engine, which means when you remove the discomfort without answering the question underneath it, you haven't solved anything. You've just cut the wire to the alarm. And now comes the twist, the part that turns this whole thing inside out. You are not the least bored generation in human history. You may be the most bored generation who has ever lived. You simply never sit still long enough to feel it. Go back to Eastwood's definition. Boredom is the unfulfilled desire for satisfying activity. Now think honestly about 40 minutes of scrolling. Was your attention fulfilled? Did it lock onto something meaningful and hold it? Or did it slide across 400 things, engaged by all of them, satisfied by none? That is textbook boredom. Fully stimulated and fully unfulfilled. You are not escaping the noonday demon. You are feeding it every few seconds so it never has to say what it wants. Gloria Mark, a researcher at the University of California, Irvine, has been measuring human attention on screens since 2004. Back then, people stayed focused on a single screen for around 2.5 minutes before switching. By the 2020s, that number had collapsed to somewhere around 47 seconds. Not because people got weaker, because the environment learned exactly which button to press and pressed it faster than any environment in history. 47 seconds. That is now roughly the length of your uninterrupted inner life. So what actually disappears when boredom disappears? Ask the researcher Teresa Belton at the University of East Anglia, who interviewed writers and artists about their childhoods. What kept coming back was not enrichment. It was emptiness. Long, unstructured, slightly dull stretches of time as children with nothing arranged for them. That emptiness was where imagination had to grow, because nothing else was going to fill the space. Now think about what you lose in your own life. Not creativity in some abstract artistic sense, something more personal. The plan you would have made in the shower. The conversation you needed to have with yourself and kept postponing. The slow realization that a job, or a habit, or a relationship isn't right, which only ever surfaces when your mind is left alone long enough to say it out loud. Those thoughts don't shout. They arrive in silence. And they arrive in the exact gaps you have been filling. Here is the modern mirror. You know the feeling of finishing 3 hours on your phone and standing up feeling worse than when you sat down. Vaguely hollow, slightly restless. Not rested, not entertained, not anything. That is not the failure of the entertainment. That is the alarm still ringing under all the noise. It never stopped. You just kept turning up the volume on everything else. Your ancestors sat in the dark with nothing, and out of that, nothing came stories, tools, gods, plans, and the entire idea of tomorrow. Boredom was the pressure. Invention was the release. You have removed the pressure, and you are quietly waiting to understand why nothing is being released. None of this means the world was better before. It means one specific thing has been taken from you so smoothly that you never noticed it leaving, and never had the chance to decide whether you wanted to keep it. So try something and notice how hard it is. Tomorrow, when you're standing in a line, leave your hand where it is. When the elevator doors close, look at the wall. When you're waiting for the water to boil, just wait. 10 minutes with nothing. See what your mind does when you stop feeding it. At first, it will be unpleasant. That's correct. That's the signal working. Then it will start to wander. Then it will start to build. You haven't been bored in years. Maybe that's the most important thing you've lost.